just turned 7:30, so I shall formally kick off the evening and welcome you all very warmly to tonight's talk, How to Create the Perfect Wife, which will be given by author Wendy Moore. Wendy Moore, as I say, has been, she's been writing for her all her life, probably, I suspect, but in particular, she's got 5 books to her name, all non-fiction books, and How to Create the Perfect Wife is was her 3rd book. It came out originally in 2013, but I discovered it last year, and I couldn't put it down. It's the most brilliant and most awful story, as Wendy will reveal, and it tells it's a real life story. It really did happen, even though actually when you're reading the book, it's like the best page turner that you'll have read in a long time, and a lot of it takes place in Lichfield, but some of it also takes place in Sutton Coldfield, so it's a very curious part of Sutton's history, and so it gives me great pleasure to be able to bring Wendy to talk about it this evening. I'll also mention that How to Create the Perfect Wife, although it's the book we're focusing on tonight, Wendy's latest book is called Endell Street. It was fairly recently a Radio 4 Book of the Week, which gives you some indication of how lucky we are to have Wendy here tonight. Wendy's also a fellow at the Royal Literary Fund based at the British Library. So she's, as I say, we're extremely lucky to have Wendy giving our talk. So without further ado, I know you're all giving her a very warm welcome, and I shall hand over to Wendy, and we'll really enjoy your talk, Wendy. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Zoe, for that lovely introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you all tonight. Obviously, it's sad that we can't all be together in Sutton Coldfield in real life, but at the same time, we don't have to struggle home through the cold and the wet and the dark afterwards. And obviously, you can help yourself to as many refreshments as you like. So I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then I'm happy to answer questions. I hope you will bear in mind that it is nearly 10 years since I wrote the book, so my recall for detailed questions may not be as good as it was 10 years ago. So today it seems as if everyone is in pursuit of the perfect partner, whether that's through Tinder or matchmaking websites or TV dating programs, or just good old-fashioned Lonely Hearts adverts. Obviously, our ability at the moment to seek and find a soulmate has been a little bit constrained over the last year. But for anyone who is still tempted to try to search for that elusive Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. Right, my book, I think, provides a cautionary tale about a man who went further than anyone else in his attempt to find the perfect partner. Well, his name was Thomas Day. This is a portrait of Thomas Day. So he was looking for his soulmate more than 2 centuries before Tinder or Naked Attraction. And a crucial part of his quest, as Zoe has mentioned, took place in the Midlands, and specifically in Sutton Coldfield. So this picture, in fact, which was painted by Joseph Wright in 1770, was painted when Day was staying in Lichfield, and he was at the time 22 years old. But before I tell you about Thomas Day's search for his perfect woman, I think it's only fair that we should look at his attributes first. So was Day the perfect man? Well, on first impressions, he might be considered an eligible bachelor. He was tall and dark and not especially unhandsome, apart from his rather podgy figure and his stooped shoulders and the smallpox scars that covered his face. So the portrait is rather flattering. And in fact, far from wearing elegant silk suits like in this painting, Day normally liked to dress in very plain, scruffy, old-fashioned clothes. He loathed fashion. And instead of sporting the conventional wig of the Georgian era, He normally liked to wear his hair long and loose and tangled. A friend of his wrote about this time, Mr. Day's exterior was not at that time prepossessing. He seldom combed his raven locks, though he was remarkably fond of washing in the stream. Well, along with his liking for skinny dipping, Day also had some other unsavoury habits. He had no table manners, he was quite awkward in mixed company, and he despised small talk, although he liked to launch into long monologues on politics and love and life. And in fact, he believed that love was really a figment of the imagination, and he thought that his ideal woman should marry him for purely logical reasons. So let's take a logical appraisal of Day's suitability as a romantic partner. Well, Day did have some merits. Firstly, he was rich. He was born in London in 1748, the only son of a prosperous government official who died when he was a baby, leaving him a fortune in trust until the age of 21. So he was brought up by his mother, whom he idolised. He was clever and well educated. He went to Charterhouse School and then Oxford University. And he was largely well-meaning and even altruistic. Day had very strong views on human rights. So he campaigned against slavery, he supported American independence, and he believed in greater democracy, for men at least. And he wanted to use his money to do good works. So in fact, Day's plan was to live a very simple life without any luxuries or servants in a remote country cottage where he could help the local peasants. But of course, he needed a soulmate, a wife, to share this life of austerity. So I've kind of created what I think might be his Lonely Hearts advertisement. And here it is. Tall, wealthy bachelor, 21, slightly scarred, but all own teeth, would love to meet young woman for shared charitable works, political discussion, and bathing in streams. Must have no sense of humour. Well, Day knew exactly the kind of woman that he wanted to marry. She had to be classically beautiful, like a Greek or Roman statue. She had to be pure and virginal. So he wanted his perfect woman to be untainted by the vices of society, like a simple country maid. But she also had to have plump white arms. He was quite insistent about that, and wear long skirts to cover her ankles. And at the same time, this simple, demure maid had to be clever and well-read, so that she could discuss weighty topics with him while appreciating his superior intellect. And at the same time, because he wanted them to live without any servants, she would have to be very hardy and strong to perform all the domestic drudgery and tend to his every need. So there we go. So not surprisingly, Day could not find this woman of his dreams in the ballrooms and parlours of Georgian society, but he did try. He was turned down by one woman whom he met while he was a student at Oxford, and he later described her as a bitch. And soon after, he became engaged to another woman, but she got cold feet, and then he described her as a toad. And so by the age of 20, he had come to the conclusion that his perfect woman did not exist. But he was not ready to either compromise or to accept a bachelor life. If he couldn't find the perfect woman, he decided he would create her. And so what Day decided to do was to obtain a young girl that he could mould into his vision of the perfect wife. So he was a real life Professor Higgins trying to groom an Eliza Doolittle into his version of My Fair Lady. And he knew where to look. So in June 1769, so just a few days after he turned 21 and had come into his fortune and his independence, Day travelled with a friend, a man called John Bicknell, to an orphanage in Shrewsbury, which was a branch of the London Foundling Hospital. So the Shrewsbury orphanage had opened in 1763 to provide accommodation for the overflow of orphans that were still arriving at the London Foundling Hospital. So when they got there, Day and Bicknell told the staff they wanted a girl to become an apprentice maid for a married friend. His name was, he was an Irish inventor called Richard Lovell Edgeworth. And this lie was essential because the charity only apprenticed girls to married men. And without question, Day and Bicknell were invited by the staff to select a girl from a line of girls who stood there in their identical brown woolen dresses and white caps. But Day, who was never comfortable with the opposite sex, of course, he was so overcome by this choice that he decided to let Bicknell pick the girl for him. And Bicknell chose a pretty 12-year-old girl who had chestnut curls and brown eyes. And then Day took the girl to London to a lodging house, and he kept her there out of the way. But he was not satisfied yet. So a few weeks later, he visited the Foundling Hospital headquarters in London, and there he chose a second girl, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed 11-year-old, by way of contrast, to make doubly sure that his experiment would be a success. So his plan was to educate them both and then choose the best pupil to become his bride. And he even signed a contract with Bicknell, who was a lawyer, promising not to violate the innocence of his chosen pupil, and that he would provide financially for her unsuccessful playfellow. And then, with astonishing arrogance, he renamed the two girls. So he called them Sabrina and Lucretia. So when I first came across Day's story, I thought it just sounded too incredible to be true. I came across it in a book by Roy Porter of medical history, just a tiny paragraph. And I was fascinated, but I thought it must be just kind of urban myth, really. So I started by reading previous biographies of Day. There have actually been 9 biographies of Thomas Day, but none of them gave hardly any details of the two girls' lives, let alone what they might have thought about this experiment. And nobody had ever managed to identify the two girls. And in fact, one 19th century writer said there was no trace in the Shrewsbury Foundling Hospital records of a girl being apprenticed to Day. So in order to start writing my book, of course, I had to first establish whether the story was fact or fiction. And since Day had, of course, renamed the two girls when he acquired them, really, I think, to prevent them being traced, I thought it might just be impossible to find them in any records. So I began by searching the huge archives of the Foundling Hospital at the London Metropolitan Archives. Well, the Foundling Hospital was established in 1741 by Thomas Coram, who was a former sea captain, and it was set up as a home for orphaned and unwanted babies. Well, in fact, most of the babies were not actually orphans at all. The majority were illegitimate babies whose mothers were too young or too poor or too ashamed to bring their children up themselves. And in fact, a smaller proportion were the babies of married couples who simply could not afford to feed another mouth. But most of their mothers and fathers believed that by taking their children to the Foundling Hospital, they would ensure they had a better upbringing than if they had kept them. And on the whole, the babies were well looked after. After being admitted, they were sent to wet nurses who essentially became their foster mothers. And they were paid to bring the children up to the age of 7 or 8. And some of these foster mothers, as you can imagine, became so attached to their foundlings that they asked to keep them. But that was very, very rarely allowed, because the governors believed that the children always fared better if they were kept in the charity's care. And so when they reached the age of 7 or 8, the children were brought back to the Foundling Hospital to be educated and trained for a job in a reputable trade or domestic service, or later on to work in the woolen and cotton mills in the industrial north. So the Foundling Hospital was very popular. Lots of rich people loved to give their money to it. William Hogarth donated paintings. George Frederick Handel composed music for the chapel services, and it was very fashionable to be seen there, as a philanthropic venture. But the charity became so overwhelmed by the sheer number of babies arriving at its door that initially it had to introduce a ballot to decide which babies would be admitted. But the demand continued to rise, and so eventually the charity had to ask for government financial help. So in 1756, the government gave the Foundling Hospital a £10,000 grant, but there was one catch, and the catch was the hospital now had to admit every baby that was taken to its door. So for the next 4 years, from 1756 to 1760, there were a total of 14,934 babies admitted to the hospital. And it was during that period, and it was called the General Reception, that Sabrina and Lucretia, as they had been renamed, had been left at the orphanage gates. And because they were obviously just 2 among many thousand babies, I thought they would probably be impossible to trace. But luckily, the charity's governors kept meticulous records on every baby that was admitted. So when each baby arrived, they took details of the child's parish of origin, if it was known, of its name, if it had already been baptized, and any other identifying information. And some of the mothers left tokens with their babies, and such as the ones that you can see. So they left thimbles, lockets, buttons, or coins. Some of them left half of a coin or half of a playing card, in the hope that one day they would be able to come back and reclaim their baby. But that also very rarely happened in practice. So once they were admitted, the babies were all given new names and a number, and the number was put on a lead tag on a ribbon around the child's neck. So I went to the London Metropolitan Archives and searched the apprenticeship record for 1769. I knew that was the year Day had apparently taken the girls. And there, to my amazement, it was plainly recorded that 2 girls were apprenticed to Richard Lovell Edgeworth, Day's friend, on the 17th of August and the 20th of September 1769. And their names, so the names that they were given when they were first admitted, were Anne Kingston and Dorcas Carr. So I had found Day's foundlings, and this was the first time they'd ever been identified, so it really was a eureka moment in the archives for me. And I know you probably won't be able to make these out, but on the left, that is Sabrina's billet form. That's the form that was filled out on the day that she was admitted. You can see the name was given as Manima, so that was supposedly her name before admission, but it was probably a misspelling for Monimia, which was meant to mean only or lonely child, or effectively orphan. So those are the details that were put down when she was admitted. On the right is her apprenticeship indenture, and again, it's too small to see, but it was, you can see that she was apprenticed to Richard Lovell Edgeworth. So I got their names, and more importantly, I had the girls' unique numbers, and that meant that I could trace them from the day they were admitted until the moment they left the orphanage. So I proved that the story was true, and now I had to find out what happened to the girls once they'd been taken by Day. Well, first of all, Day smuggled the girls to France, where he could educate them away from prying eyes. And it all went very well at first. In a letter that was dictated by Sabrina and sent from the lodgings they were staying in Avignon, she wrote, "I love Mr. Day best in the world." So she couldn't actually write herself at that moment. That's what, at that time, she had to dictate that to him. And judging from that devotion, it's scarcely surprising that Sabrina became his preferred pupil. After a few months in France, Day decided that Lucretia was invincibly stupid. So he returned to London and he apprenticed Lucretia to a milliner with a £400 farewell gift. So that's worth about £60,000 in today's money. So I think she was not quite such a dumb blonde after all. And then in spring 1770, Day moved to Lichfield. He took a villa, Stowe House, beside the lake there, with Sabrina. Well, he chose Lichfield because his friend Erasmus Darwin, the local doctor who would become the grandfather of Charles Darwin, lived there. And Day and his friend Edgeworth were both adopted into Darwin's sociable circle. So they both became members of the Lunar Society. And that was a group of scientists and radical thinkers who lived in the Midlands, and they met each month to have dinner and to talk about the latest advances in science and technology and industry. It was a kind of LinkedIn for the 18th century, I think. And they called it the Lunar Society because they met on the Sunday or Monday nearest to the full moon, and not for any particularly nefarious reasons, but so that the members could easily travel by moonlight. So living in Lichfield, Day could concentrate on educating his chosen child bride. But he wasn't working in a vacuum. He had a template for his project. Like his friend Edgeworth, Day was a big fan of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Well, Rousseau had been born in Geneva, and he wrote some of the most pioneering and controversial books ever published. His book, The Social Contract, inspired the founding fathers of the American independence and the leaders of the French Revolution. And his book on education, which is called Emile, shaped education and policy from that day to this. So in his book Emile, Rousseau advocated a progressive, child-centered education, which allowed children to develop and learn at a natural pace. So it was a learning by doing approach, which meant that children should learn through discovery and play. And I'm sure you realise that educational policy has swung backwards and forwards ever since then. So Rousseau's idea of children learning by doing has had its moment at many times and gone back again. Well, Day's friend Edgeworth had already adopted this method to educate his eldest son, Dick. So from the age of 3, Dick was encouraged to run barefoot and free and to just explore at will. There were no restraints, no rules, no punishments. Dick was allowed to do exactly as he liked. And to his father's bafflement, Dick grew up to be a rowdy, spoiled, wild little monster who would answer to nobody except his father. And despite the difficulties in bringing up Dick, Day was very keen to use Rousseau's method in educating Sabrina. So he taught Sabrina to write, to do arithmetic. He taught her about history and philosophy and science. But there was also another side to this Rousseau approach. As well as the kindly method of learning through discovery, Rousseau also believed that children should be inured to fear and pain and extremes of climate. So in fact, the Rousseau philosophy was very popular with parents in Georgian times. And some parents really took his philosophy to extremes. The Prince and Princess of Württemberg, for example, they bathed their 4-month-old baby, Sophie, every day in an ice-cold fountain, and then they left her outdoors naked. And they boasted that she rarely cried. I think she was probably too cold. And a Swiss father, who was another disciple, he would turf his 5 daughters out into the woods every day, almost naked, to forage for food. And so Day followed this same philosophy with Sabrina while living in Stowe House in Lichfield. If you know Lichfield, as I'm sure you probably do, being so close, you might recognise Stowe House. It's the house on the opposite side of Stowe Pool from the town itself, still there today, and very beautiful, kind of haunting to look at, I think. And I've actually been there, and it's been quite interesting to go inside, because behind those closed doors, Day was performing quite sadistic trials in order to test Sabrina's resistance to extremes of pain and fear and hardship. So he would order her to sit silently while he dropped hot sealing wax on her naked arms and shoulders. He forced her to stand unflinching while he fired a pistol at her skirts. He made her wade into the lake, into Stowe Pool, up to her neck, so she couldn't actually swim. And then he got her to lie in the fields until her wet clothes dried in the sun. And he even stuck pins in her flesh. And whether those physical ordeals went even further will probably never be known. Day had, of course, signed a contract with his friend, promising not to violate the innocence of his chosen pupil. And his friends, especially in the Lunar Society, would always be at pains to insist that his actions were entirely honourable. There's no direct evidence that he did take sexual advantage of her. And I think really probably Day was asexual, if anything. But even if he didn't actually violate her sexually, his actions in living alone with her at that time would certainly have tarnished her reputation. Well, not surprisingly, after enduring these ordeals and the domestic drudgery, because they had no servants, for a year, the teenage Sabrina began to rebel. And at that point, Day placed her in a boarding school in Sutton Coldfield for 3 years. So why did he choose Sutton Coldfield? Well, probably because it was close enough to Lichfield so that he could still visit her when he went to see his friends. So he was a member of the Lunar Society, and a frequent visitor to Erasmus Darwin and others. But it was also remote enough and quiet enough and off the beaten track enough to be able to keep her a secret. At the time, in 1771, Sutton Coldfield was a quite small town. It boasted some fine houses and a church and even a book club, but not much else. There was no theatre or concert hall, little fine social life. And it had a bit of a reputation for hard drinking and lawlessness. I'm sure that's not the case still today. But Day placed her in what he described as a very reputable school. Sadly, it's not been possible to identify the school or where it was. It would have been a small private school. And he occasionally wrote to her and occasionally visited, but mostly to lecture her or admonish her for her behaviour. So for the most of the next 3 years, she was basically on her own, living in this school. Through the weekends and holidays when others went home, she had to stay there. And in the meantime, Thomas Day decided he would try to obtain a wife by more conventional means. So over the next few years, he proposed to a succession of young women. And yet somehow his invitation to live as his domestic slave in complete seclusion from society failed to appeal to any of them. One woman rejected him after he sent her a parcel full of his, it was a big parcel containing his rules and expectations of married life. And another turned him down when he refused to let her keep some diamond earrings. And then one woman agreed that she would marry him if he would just spruce himself up a little. So remember, he had scruffy hair and liked to wash it in streams. And so at that point, Day went to France for a year in order to acquire the social graces that he lacked. So he learnt to fence, he learnt to dance the minuet, and to dress himself as a model Georgian dandy. Just as he had attempted to groom Sabrina to become his perfect wife, now he submitted to be moulded into the perfect gentleman. I think, as Zoe said, you could not make this up, really. But when he returned from France to claim the hand of his fiancée, this dandified Day looked so ridiculous that she burst out laughing, and he was on his own once again. And at that point, he actually etched a poem onto a window in an inn in Sutton Coldfield to lament his rejection. And then in desperation, having been rejected by 3 women, he went back to Sabrina. So he took her away from her school. He now apprenticed her to a dressmaker's, probably locally in Lichfield, I think. And he resumed her education himself. So now he was 28 and she was 17. It didn't seem quite such a difficult age difference at that point. And he was actually on the verge of marrying her. So his friends were expecting him to marry at any moment, when suddenly he decided to cast her aside because she had disobeyed an order about how she should wear her dress. So just a trivial little thing about how her handkerchief should lie around her dress. So at that point, he gave her a pension, so she had an annual sum, but he never saw her again. Well, against all the odds, as you might imagine, Day did find his perfect wife. In 1778, he married Esther Milnes, who, as you can see, perhaps was a beautiful, very clever, very talented heiress. And she idolized him. She saw Day as being a kind of unworldly poet, and she admired his political ideals. And really, they should have been perfectly happy. Esther surrendered all her comforts and her interests to live with Day on a barren farm, giving out food and money and medicine to the local people. And Day made Esther give up her poetry. She was an accomplished poet, her harpsichord, she was a talented musician, and her friends, while he went out into the world to make a name for himself as a poet and a political speaker and a writer. In fact, his children's books, he started writing children's books. There were 3 volumes. It was called The History of Sandford and Merton. They became bestsellers and Victorian classics. So everyone from Dickens read his books. He was the J.K. Rowling of his day. But Day was still not satisfied. He continually criticised and corrected Esther's conduct. So they had lots of arguments. At least twice she decided to leave him. And it reminds me of the joke, when she married Mr. Right, she didn't realise that his first name was Always. But when he died in 1789, he was actually thrown from a horse that he had tried to train according to his liberal ideas. Esther was devastated. She never really recovered from his death. But what happened to the subject of Day's experiment, to Sabrina? Well, she eventually did marry to Day's friend, John Bicknell, the lawyer who had actually first chosen her from that line in the Shrewsbury orphanage. And it's not really clear whether he was more attracted by Sabrina or by the £500 that Day had provided as her dowry. But her marital life was short. She had 2 sons, but Bicknell, who was a bit of a drunkard and in huge debt, he died while his children were still babies. So Sabrina was widowed, she had 2 young sons, and she was virtually penniless. She actually had to work in a school as a maid until she was rescued from her life by Charles Burney, the brother of the novelist Fanny Burney, who gave her a job as his housekeeper for his boarding school for boys in Greenwich. And this is the only portrait I've been able to find. I think it's the only portrait that exists of Sabrina. She's 75 by this point, but she's still got her curly, lovely chestnut curls. And I think she's got a bit of a twinkle in her eye, as if she's got a bit of a story to tell. So for 33 years, Sabrina helped run the Burney School. It ended up in Greenwich. Strangely enough, it was round the corner from where I used to live in Greenwich. I only belatedly discovered that Burney Street was named after the Burney School. So she had been the subject of this remarkable 18th century educational experiment. But now she was helping to educate the future leaders of the 19th century. And yet all her life, she was really still haunted by the role she had played in Day's social experiment and the shame of her origins as an illegitimate baby in the Foundling Hospital. So she'd kept her past a secret from her sons. And then in the early 19th century, stories appeared in the press which revealed her origins. And so she was utterly mortified. Her eldest son, John, was so shocked when he read about her past that he became ill. He never properly recovered. But Sabrina weathered the storm. She stayed friends with many of Day's friends, with Erasmus Darwin and with Richard Lovell Edgeworth. And she died a respectable Victorian grandmother and matron at the age of 86 in 1843 in a fine house in Greenwich. She's buried in Kensal Green Cemetery, Victorian society's most fashionable final resting places. And the story of Thomas Day's attempt to train an orphan to become his perfect wife was widely known throughout the 19th century. It inspired novels by Henry James and Anthony Trollope, and it may even have influenced George Bernard Shaw when he wrote his play Pygmalion, which then became, of course, the musical My Fair Lady. And today, I think it does still provide us with a sobering lesson, because I think if we seek perfection, the moral is that we are likely to be forever disappointed. The perfect man or woman does not exist. But if we're lucky, we may just find somebody who matches us perfectly. So thank you for listening to me. As I said, I'm very happy to answer questions about the book. If you have other questions, you're obviously very welcome to buy the book. I hope you will, or borrow it from the library. And also my new book, Endell Street, which I'm also happy to answer questions about. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed, Wendy. We may not be able to find the perfect husband or wife in that ideal sense, but for me, I know I said this to you when we first met, I'm such a fan. I think your book is pretty near being a perfect read, and I would really heartily encourage people to seek out a copy. All the details will be sent to audience members tomorrow, so that they can either order. There are copies in the Birmingham Library service, or obviously buy your own copy. Now, please, if you've got questions, now's the perfect time to start submitting them through the Q&A. I find it quite tantalizing looking at that wonderful portrait of Sabrina and thinking this woman as a teenager walked presumably the high street here, Mill Street, and knew the town fairly well. I don't know quite what a life would have been like for a 15, 16, 17-year-old who was a boarder in, what are we talking, the 1770s, 1780s, you know, whether she was allowed to walk alone or whether she always had to be accompanied, but that she would have known the Holy Trinity that we know here, that she would have known the 3 Tons, at least as a building. That's one of the main inns, pubs here in Sutton. And that then this teenager who lived here in Sutton, like my own teenagers perhaps, went on to inspire, as you say, James Trollope and perhaps Bernard Shaw. So I think that's a very exciting. Now we've got a question from Deborah, and her she'd like to know how you came across the story initially. So I think you briefly mentioned a medical text, a medical book, was that it? Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, well, it's actually on my bookshelf behind me, if you can see it. It's that big blue book. It's a brilliant book about medical history by Roy Porter, who was the sublime writer on medical history. I'm a journalist by training, and spent a lot of time writing about health and social care. And then I studied medical history, so I did a diploma in medical history. So that's why I started reading his book. And as soon as I started reading about medical history, I realized there are all these incredible stories there that hadn't been told, certainly not been told for a general or popular audience. So one of the stories I came across very early on was this one. And in Roy Porter's book, it just warrants a few sentences, really. Just it mentions the Lunar Society, which is obviously based in your area, and that one of the members, Thomas Day, who was the youngest member, decided to perform this very unusual social experiment to see if he could train the perfect wife, and mentioned that he took 2 girls from an orphanage from the Foundling Hospital. So I kind of kept that snippet in a folder, and I wrote my first 2 books, which so the first one was medical history, the second one was more social history. And then when I wanted to write a 3rd book, I thought, I'm going to go back to that story and just see if it's true or not. And as I said, I thought it probably wasn't going to be true. I thought either it won't be true or it would just be impossible to find out any information about it. So that's what led me to go to the Foundling Hospital archives. And it had been said that there were no records of this child. So I was kind of almost misled by being told in a 19th century book that there was no record in their archives of 2 girls being taken in the Shrewsbury archives. And in fact, it wasn't in the Shrewsbury archives because all the archives were kept in the London Foundling Hospital. But it was relatively easy to find Richard Lovell Edgeworth's name and these 2 girls who were apprenticed to him. The rest of the story was quite a lot more difficult to flesh out because she was
such a. I was just imagining you coming across those records, and the thrill of that must have been just tremendous, making that first real connection that could then, lead you on your journey. So
yeah, it's one of those moments in a library when you really do want to shout out and cheer, and have to restrain yourself.
I think a bit of joy is always good in a library. I think you allow that. I have another comment. Fascinating story. Thank you. The interesting link with Stowe House, and it would be really great to trace the school here in Sutton. Have you any potential leads? And I know, Wendy, when I very first contacted you, I was like, what else can you tell me about the school in Sutton? So what can you tell us, Wendy?
I mean, I did read, and it's about 10 years ago that I did the research now, so I did read lots of histories of Sutton Coldfield, contemporary histories. And there was just no mention of a school that, there were kind of, from my memory, there were, schools that were quite well known, but no mention of a girls' boarding school that I came across. So really, I think, it's a project for somebody else. You're probably better placed than I am to try and track down the building itself, if it still exists.
I certainly know that there's quite a few members of the local history research group in the audience this evening, and so I am throwing down the gauntlet, which is a very appropriate phrase to say for Sutton Coldfield with our Mary Ashford connections, but that's a story for another day. I'm throwing down the gauntlet to anybody who would like to try and track down a girls' boarding school in Sutton in the 1780s, and then we could maybe come back to 1770s.
1770s, yeah, 1771 to 74, I think it was, yeah.
Well, that's right. Now I remember, and then we could come back to you on that. You mentioned the inn where Day inscribed a poem, and I think that's another one where I'd like to throw it out to the audience to say, when we're allowed back in pubs, can you all please check the windows? Because I understand, Wendy, you're not quite sure which building that was in.
No, again, there's no record of which pub that was. I mean, I have to say it was it sounds a bit like vandalism, doesn't it? But it was quite a common thing to write things on glass. You do it with your diamond ring or something like that. Writing a long poem was probably a bit unusual, but then that's Thomas Day for you.
Yes, exactly. So there's another mystery that we could solve, or another bit of the jigsaw puzzle we could perhaps put together. So I've got another comment. Hi Wendy, I will definitely be purchasing your book, jolly good, because I do recommend it, as it has links to the Lunar Society. I used to work at Soho House Museum, one of the meeting places of the Lunar Society. Did Day ever take Sabrina with him to meetings?
Okay, let me just try and cast my mind back. So I can't honestly remember specifically whether he did. I'm pretty sure that he would have taken her at times. She definitely was a regular visitor to Erasmus Darwin's house. She was taken under his wing. And many of the Lunar Circle, they did include their children in meetings. So in the book, I talk about some of the other children who described the meetings. Anne-Marie Schimmelpink is the name that I'm recalling. She describes being invited to come along, and somebody had found a snake, and it had escaped. So there definitely were children who went to, and young people who went to the meetings. Richard Lovell Edgeworth as well would take his young children, and he'd pass scientific instruments among them, and some people were aghast that these expensive instruments were being passed among the children. And of course, I mean, Joseph Wright is my favorite painter, actually, and he painted. He was friendly with various Lunar Society members, and he painted those wonderful pictures, the experiment on a bird in an air pump, which is believed to depict a Lunar Society meeting. And in that, you've got the children watching this experiment. And of course, that was totally the Rousseau approach. The Rousseau approach was that you involved children, you showed them, you taught them by showing them. So that was all very much in line with that philosophy. So I think the short answer is I'm pretty sure she would have gone to meetings, and she did definitely know various of them.
Yes, so she wasn't kept secret from them. It wasn't that he had a lot to
They very much apologised for what he did. They covered it up. They were apologists for his actions. Some of them tried to dissuade him. William Small, for example, tried to find him a different wife, and he succeeded. He's the one who put him in touch eventually with Esther Milnes. And Edgeworth, who's my favourite character in the whole book, who was just such this wonderful, ebullient man who got married 4 times and had 22 children. He really was, I think, the most honourable. He did keep in touch with Sabrina all her life, and really did encourage and help her.
Thank you. So our next question is, was it possible to find out anything about the circumstances of Sabrina and Lucretia when they were placed at the Foundling Hospital? I know that's not that they weren't known by those names at that point, but were you able to, were they actually orphans, or were they, as you described, just coming from very poor families that could no longer afford them?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to find out, who their parents might have been. They both were taken there as babies and left there. The billet form I showed of Sabrina's when she was admitted, it's got very bare details. They both came from Clerkenwell. No parents are named. There's no real clues to where they'd come from. And and it said they'd both been baptised in Clerkenwell, but there's no records in any Clerkenwell churches of them being baptised. So I suspect they actually were born in the workhouse there. So their mothers, were probably in the workhouse, may have died when they gave birth. Sabrina's original name when she came there was Monimia, which means orphan. So I think it's likely they knew she was an orphan already when she was admitted there. So yeah, that was frustrating. It would have been, lovely to find out more about their origins. But once they'd been admitted, I could then find out what happened to them. So they were both sent to foster parents separately. They were about a year difference in age and difference in when they were admitted. So you could trace, where they went to, where the foster parents were, how many children they had. She went to foster parents in Dorking, first of all, Sabrina did, and then she was sent to Shrewsbury and sent to a foster parent there as well. So, it's possible to piece together their lives. And, the Foundling Hospital archives are astonishing. The Shrewsbury Hospital has its own huge ledger, which says day by day what they were doing, how the children were looked after, just remarkable documents. So that was, it was a real pleasure to research.
I can imagine you maybe have little nuggets that you've put away for future books, little stories that maybe have yet to grow, but little descriptions of names or those tokens that are sort of composting away in your head for future stories. I've got just a comment, not a question, but the company this person works for is based at Stowe House now. It's a beautiful building, and what a fascinating history it has. She'll be looking at it with new eyes when she's next in the building, so that would be really exciting. You'll be able to walk the floorboards that Day walked, and maybe even walk on the spot where Day shot past Sabrina's petticoats. So very lucky you. There's a comment here. It does seem that Day was searching for a mother replacement if he had idolized his mother. Is there much known about his early life? Over attachment, perhaps?
Well, yeah, I do think, I'm not going to blame the mother because I definitely wouldn't do that, but I do think his early life has got quite a lot to explain his behaviour. His father died when he was a baby, so he was brought up by his mother, and he was devoted to her, but he was sent away to boarding school, as a lot of wealthy young boys were, at the age of 7. And she then remarried, and I think that was probably significant. I don't think he liked his stepfather, who was quite strict. And it's a strange sort of situation because, he was going to come into his fortune when he was 21. So he had this, fortune waiting for him, and his independence then. But, while he was growing up, he was dependent on his mother and stepfather for pocket money, and he really resented that. So I think that partly explains his behaviour, but not entirely, because lots of people had similar experiences at that time and didn't grow up into being the kind of utter misery and arrogant monster that he became.
It's interesting you call him a monster, because one of the things I found so tantalizing in the book is that actually he isn't a through and through monster. Well, at least I didn't feel like, you know, he argues passionately in favour of American independence. He is a very anti-slavery. He, as you say, goes on to write basically the first ever children's book, and become feted for, you know, being this you know, starting children's literature. So there are all these facets to him that are, you might think, sort of are on the plus side. And
Yeah,
yet these
yeah.
other sides of him dripping the wax and putting the pins in and torturing poor
Mhm,
Sabrina. So yes,
mhm.
he's a monster, but not through and through, I felt.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the previous biographies of him, mainly by 19th century writers, and several of them by his close friends, you know, wax lyrical about all his wonders that he did. So, you know, they adored him because he was a philanthropist. He was liberal. You know, he, like I said, he opposed slavery, supported American independence, was a writer, a bit of a poet. So they did, you know, they thought he was, you know, wonderful in lots of ways, his close friends. But it was all about men, partly. You know, he basically thought women were completely inferior, and I know that was quite current at the time. But he had such arrogance and such entitlement, mainly born out of his wealth, and the only reason he was really able to take these two children from the Foundling Hospital was his wealth. It was, you know, they were actually quite strict about who the children were apprenticed to. So it was very highly unusual that they actually allowed this to happen. And, you know, his friends tried to cover up for him. So I think the whole story is just full of such ironies, really, that he opposed slavery, but in a sense, he did have these two girls effectively
Enslaved.
as slaves. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've only got time for one more question. So, and I suspect it's a horrible one to end on, because I think you might want to talk at length about it. But I think this is from Madeline. I think the most attractive character in the book is Richard Lovell Edgeworth. Could you tell us a little bit more about him and how you researched him?
Right. Well, as I said, he definitely was my favourite character. I had a bit of a soft spot for Rousseau as well, but Edgeworth, Edgeworth was just so human. He was flawed in lots of ways. So he had 4 wives. He married the first wife because he got her pregnant, basically, but at least he had the honour to marry her. They didn't get on. He didn't like her very much, but he stuck with her. He fell in love with Honora Sneyd, who lived in Lichfield. She was a friend of Anna Seward, and she was one of the women who rejected Thomas Day because she was basically in love with Edgeworth. And so when Edgeworth's first wife died in childbirth, he rushed to Lichfield and married her. He was besotted with her. He just had such energy. So he was an inventor. All these kind of strange contraptions would come out of his workshop. He invented the first kind of tank, basically, a moving engine, an umbrella to keep haystacks dry. You know, just such a fascinating person to have at a dinner party, I think. And he had 22 children, but spent lots of time with his children. So he would, you know, really put the Rousseau ideas into action. You know, he would have them all around him while he was building a wall or doing whatever, so they could watch. He encouraged his daughter Maria to write books. So initially they wrote books together, and then she became one of the 18th, 19th century's best known novelists. So he encouraged her. And he was appalled by the way Thomas Day treated Sabrina. So there were lovely letters. I think actually the letters are what really speaks, you know, gives you the voice, because Edgeworth's letters are just full of humour and affection to Sabrina. The letters that Thomas Day wrote to her are just full of justification for how he had treated her. So yeah, Edgeworth is the person I'd most like to invite to a dinner party.
Yes, I can imagine. I think I'm with you. So, and I think that's a lovely. There are a couple more comments, but I know we're running out of time, and we've already run over. And I just wanted to take the opportunity on behalf of everyone who's joined us this evening to really thank you, Wendy. You talked about those letters from Edgeworth being full of humour and affection, but actually this evening's talk had both humour. I mean, I love that image of the ideal wife, and of affection and empathy for Sabrina, and so it's been a really lovely talk. And as I say, I'm so pleased to have been able to bring you here tonight. And on behalf of everyone, I'd like to say thank you very much. So I can hear everybody all around Sutton and beyond applauding you. And with that, I will say to our lovely audience who've joined us tonight, thank you very much again for joining us this evening. It's always a pleasure to host you and to share these talks with you. I do hope we'll see you at our next talk in April, the Flora of Sutton Park. And yes, please do, if you've got a couple of minutes at the end when you leave, please complete the very short survey for us. Thanks very much. I hope you all stay safe, stay well, and enjoy what sunshine is coming as spring gets a proper foothold here. Thanks very much. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.